Hey folks, time to switch things up a bit and take a retrospective look at 5 mostly revered films that are absolutely marred by a single visual effect that really only served to be the proverbial shit stain on your Aunt Sally's otherwise perfect white linen pantsuit. Now, I myself have worked in the industry as a visual effects artist, though I suppose you wouldn't know it from some of the crappy little effects I've added to my videos, but hey, who knows? Maybe on this topic, I have a little keener insight than most. So let's get into it, shall we?
Say hello to my little friend!
I wanted a mission. And for my sins, I gave you once.
Echoes of eternity!
Number 1, Aliens, Rear Projection Follies. James Cameron's follow-up to Ridley Scott's masterpiece Alien was, in the summer of 1986, a certifiable blockbuster. Cameron wisely elected not to emulate the original in its slow-burn gothic horror tones, and instead made a pretty kick-ass action film. Boy, in terms of visual effects, there was a lot to appreciate, from the look of planet LV-426 to the look of the space vessel Sulaco to the actual aliens and Queen Alien herself. But even for its time, Aliens also has some seriously head-scratching low points. It's clear the ambitions of what Cameron was reaching for far exceeded his grasp, not unlike Justin Trudeau tackling simple math.
And the budget will balance itself.
Now, he could have taken a serious cue here from Sir Ridley Scott. Now, if something looks fake, just obscure it with haze and smoke, or even only show it on a sketchy monitor. A brilliant workaround. Scott refused to shoot a scene that didn't absolutely stand up to the high standards of the film, but not so with James Cameron, however. So, what sucked? Well, certainly I could go on about the awful integration of the dropship model looking like a dinky toy as it plummets towards the planet, replete with obvious black matte edges, terrible interactive lighting, and horrendous motion tracking with the camera. But the real shit-stained dick in the eye is in the god-awful use of rear projection in some key sequences. Like the scene where the dropship begins to tumble out of control towards our heroes in the foreground. Now, does anyone actually buy that these two areas exist in the same universe? Well, if so, I'd like to show you some prime real estate in Fukushima. The blacks are way off, and despite being shot with a relatively wide-angled lens where we wouldn't expect much fall off in focus at all, the background looks about as uniformly soft as my penis checking out Dylan Mulvaney's swimsuit spread. Now later, near the exciting conclusion of the film, we get another woefully inept rear projection shot of Ripley and Newt standing on a platform above the exploding reactor. And that looks about as convincing as some shitty Sword and Sandal epics from the 50s. I mean, talk about just yanking an audience right out of an action sequence. So once again, it's a case of too much to focus on the stuff blowing up in the background, and not a great match on the blacks compared to the practical set as well. Now, given the period in which Aliens was made and the limits of visual effects at the time, how would I have approached these scenes other than just canning the rear projection and going with a comp? Well, in the case of the dropship explosion, I would have darkened the projection as well, made it a little less blue. Also, the blacks make them a little closer to what we're seeing in the foreground plate. Then I'd create a mid-gown practical layer of boulders or whatever to at least bridge the obvious gap between plate and projection. Next, lay off on the amount of defocus so it all feels like it was shot with the same lens. Then obscure the shit out of everything with more foreground, midground, and background smoke, rain, etc., you name it. Now in the second example, I'd honestly stay away from super wide shots. The effect looks better, honestly, the closer in on Ripley and Newt we are. And again, better match of blacks, less defocus, more smoke to obscure all the ugliness as much as possible. But hey, fuck me, what do I know? Number 2, Solaris, worst twist-ending VFX shot ever. Andrei Tarkovsky's 1972 3-hour pretentious sci-fi slog is considered a masterpiece by many film snobs, Certainly not by me, however. It's the story of Russian psychiatrist Chris Kelvin, who rockets off to space station in a far-off solar system that orbits a strange living planet. Now, much of the crew is either missing or gone batshit crazy, and it's here that Kelvin discovers that the planet is in fact manifesting people from the memories of the crew, and in the case of Kelvin, his long-dead wife. Now, if your idea of good science fiction is about ponderous dolts walking around a space station that looks like it's constructed of balsa wood and furnished with moldy IKEA stock, all the while barfing out reams of uninteresting dialogue, then man, is this ever the film for you. But nonetheless, for a film with not much in the way of actual visual effects, from the brief glimpse of the silly-looking space station to a rather unconvincing attempt at showing weightlessness, the final shot is such a painful eyesore, it must truly be regarded as one of the worst visual effects ever. Now, Kelvin, who looks like the Russian Barney Rubble, eventually goes back to Earth, or at least so he thinks. Now, and we pull back from his farmhouse in the Russian countryside to see that, in fact, it's all just a manifestation of the planet. But he's never actually left Solaris. But man alive, do you really want to present a moment that is to this film what the devastated Statue of Liberty was to Planet of the Apes with such a putrid-looking visual effect? I mean, does this in any way, shape, or form look at all realistically integrated? The shape of the land just sits atop the planet, looking about as out of place as a sincere laugh during an Amy Schumer comedy special. So, given the limitations of practical visual effects in 1972, and let's not harp on the year it was made too much, remembering this little sci-fi film came out 4 years earlier, what would I have done? Well, if I was the director, I might have scrapped the scene altogether and made it a little more ambiguous, kind of like the end of Inception with the spinning top. Now, the first clue that all is not what it seems is when Kelvin looks inside the farmhouse and discovers it's raining on the inside, even dousing his father, who appears to be oblivious to getting wet. As if this recreation of Earth based on memories has some gaps in earthbound physics. Then, cut to the realization dawning on our protagonist's face, then fade to black, roll credits, and let the audience figure it all out on the ride back home. But if I have no choice, and I'm the VFX soup, I'd at least build a practical model of the island, set it in the water so I could get some sense of the waves cresting or reacting to the landmass they're crashing into. I'd also attempt to show a bit of the island under the water and disappearing into the depths. I mean, anything to just make these two elements feel like they're existing in the same universe. God, what an eyesore. Well, hey, welcome to the arbitrary point just before the halfway point in this episode, folks. Sure hope you're enjoying it. So, I got a fun little contest for y'all. Now, on the count of 3, I'm gonna chug this tumbler of Canadian Club whiskey. And I'm betting I can empty this glass faster than you can hit those subscribe and like buttons. And just what's in it for you, you may ask? Well, an absolutely free membership to Acid Test Cinema, where every week I'll be humbly serving up new reviews to keep you informed on the latest films, plus my retrospective look back at films from yesteryear. Now, are you game? Come on, let's do it. On the count of 3. 1, 2, 3. Holy smokes, you beat me! All right, come on. Best 2 out of 3. Let's do it. Let's do this. Number 3, Air Force One, god-awful plane crash. Wolfgang Petersen's 1997 mega hit about the US president doing his best John McClane impersonation, going up against a band of terrorists that have just hijacked Air Force One, was a decent, if not a little bit ludicrous action flick when it was released. Now, Harrison Ford pitted against the scene-chewing Gary Oldman as the evil Ivan, well, that was a lot of fun to watch. And for the most part, the visual effects and overall production felt pretty decent for the time. Now that is until they crash the jumbo jet into the Atlantic Ocean, well then it just flat out sucks. I mean, yes, again, let's account for the fact that CGI visual effects were, if not exactly in their infancy, well, they were somewhere in their pre-teen years at least. But let's not forget Toy Story came out 2 years earlier, and the pretty exceptional dinosaurs of Jurassic Park a full 4 years earlier. So, how to explain this travesty of a sequence? Well, from the piss-poor obvious comp of the open door with a little man hanging on for dear life, to the half-baked, tepid, bland lighting of the 747, including its odd bright blue cockpit windows, to the elevated blacks that don't match the water footage, and to the lack of water reflection on the bottom of the plane, or in fact, shadow of the plane on the surface of the water. This is just a rolling train wreck in the form of a plane crash, folks. Also of laughable note, the impact splash and waves look utterly fake, like soft mist created with cotton balls, with no harder edge actual waves or believable water disturbance. And the animation looks weightless and in defiance of at least 7 principles of physics. Look, this is a hard mechanical object you're emulating, and that's the one thing that even early on in the infancy of CGI you could pull off successfully. CGI was made for this sort of thing. Did I mention 4 years prior to this, Jurassic Park brought actual dinosaurs to life? Hell, I even went back 20 years to Airport 77 where they crashed a jumbo jet into the ocean using a physical miniature. Now, it's clearly not great, but even that feels more realistic than this garbage. I mean, honest to God, folks, in my world, this looks like a temp version 1 render without much in the way of lighting. You know, just to show an update or something on the animation, nothing more. Now, what would I have done? Well, I simply would have fired everyone that had a hand in this sequence and sought out the Jurassic Park guys. And if they don't pick up, maybe I'm calling the geezers who did Airport 77. Number 4, Logan's Run. Worst attempt at lake ever. From 1976, Michael Anderson's cheesy as all hell sci-fi dystopian flick, Logan's Run is, I suppose, an all too easy target. But fuck it. Every now and then I like to punch down. So, Logan's Run takes place in the distant future after the world has essentially shit the bed on itself. Pretty common theme in this era before Star Wars came along and shook things up. Now, there is, however, a dome-protected civilization of fresh-faced, youthful cannon fodder decked out in fruity wardrobe that live a relatively joyful, hedonistic lifestyle. Well, that is until they reach the ripe old age of 30. Then it's time for them to get laser blasted in the guts as they float around a big crystal while wearing goalie masks and the most flamboyant leotards this side of Cirque du Soleil. So our 2 leads, played by Michael York and the very hot Jenny Agutter, decide to get out of Dodge before the clock strikes 30 on them. And then a bunch of forgettable shit happens as they wander the earth and, yada yada yada. So, look, there's just an abundance of putrid effects to point and snicker at here. Now, I could do a 2-part series on this film alone, from the shopping mall interiors, to laughably stupid single-occupant hover thingies, to god-awful set extensions and matte paintings, and even a chrome robot that looks like a dude trapped in a silver box on grocery cart wheels that seems about as sturdy as a one-legged ping pong table. Now for this episode, I'm going to focus on the shitty-looking interior dome city itself, and specifically the attempt to create what I suppose is meant to be a lake in the center of the city reflecting the buildings around it. I mean, Good Lord! The lake is supposed to be hundreds of meters away from us, yet look at the size and nature of the waves. Are you telling me that looks like anything more than swimming pool water about a meter away from your face? A massive body of water viewed from this distance never looks like this. And what's more, the creative zeros that engineered this garbage actually purposely stirred up the water to create this effect. As if the building structures, trees, and monorails didn't look fake enough, the absolute cherry on the top of this shit cupcake is this abysmal attempt at water. Now, what would I have done, once again, with the technological limits of the era and specific to the water? Well, I'm making the water as still as possible, and if it continues to roll around like pool water, then maybe I lose the water altogether and just have a shiny, dark blue or gray surface with a little less reflection on it. Maybe even add a tiny little ridges to the surface to emulate far-off waves. And beyond that, I might hunt down the perpetrators of this mess and have them chemically castrated so these idiot genes could never be passed on into the future. But, on the other hand, this film is so campy, maybe the best thing would be to just leave it alone and keep the laughs coming. Number 5, Deliverance, Dazed and Confused for Night. Okay, so I've saved the very best film for last, and it really breaks my heart what was perpetrated on this John Boorman masterpiece. Deliverance, released in 1972, is the story of 4 regular city guys heading out to rural Georgia for a weekend of camping and canoeing that goes right off the rails when they cross paths with a collection of nasty, inbred hillbillies. At its heart, Deliverance is a brilliant and riveting take on masculinity, an otherwise flawless gem of a film, with one gross visual imperfection that comes around the midway point of the story. Now, it's nighttime in the cold, rushing water at the bottom of a gorge, and the men believe there's a hillbilly sniper on the cliffs above, just waiting to pick them off when they move out into the open. So John Voight elects to scale the gorge with a crossbow and take him out. Now, the scene was shot, as many intended night shots are in the movies, in daylight, to be later darkened down to appear as night, usually with some kind of blue filter that I guess is symbolic of night. Now, why do they do this? Because shooting at night using natural light looks something like this footage I recently shot in a forest. Now, digital cameras are better able to expose details in the dark, but the old film cameras would be terrible at this. So, night scenes would be shot in regular daylight, and at some point we'd get a cutaway shot of a full moon to explain the bright highlights against tree trunks, and everything would be darkened down with a blue cast. Now, check out this day for night sequence from Mad Max Fury Road. Is night ever that saturated blue? But hey, at least they had the smarts to shoot in overcast conditions, removing the problem of blown out highlights and crisp shadows. Now sadly, the day for night sequence in Deliverance is an absolute craptacular of sloppy, half-assed artistry that must go down as the worst day for night sequence of all time. And the real kick in the balls is, I believe this was perpetrated for the 40th anniversary re-release of the film. Now, I honestly have no idea what the original version of the film looked like, but could it really have been any worse than this so-called upgrade? I mean, imagine turning 40 and getting this bouquet of rotting gorilla dicks presented to you. Now check out the horrendous clamping down of bright sun highlights in the water. Boy, does that ever look natural to you, huh? How much radioactive waste has to be dumped in a river before it starts looking like that? How about looking up the cliff at a rock face and sky that looks like incomprehensible mush? And notice the bright edges around the trees. Well, why are the trees glowing? Well, probably because the mat used to separate them from the sky still retains much of the bright sky from the original plate. And check out this neat shot of John Voight hanging on a rock ledge above dull blue posterized water with warm hits of sunshine in his hair. Then John just kind of disappears into the muddy murk. only to appear later with half his face removed by a soft-edged rotomask. And, of course, the ever-present radiation-spewing trees in the background. Now, who on earth perpetrated this travesty? Was it some kids in a basement somewhere just kind of fucking around? And more importantly, who on earth okayed this mess? So, how would I have approached this? Seeing how I think it was done with fairly modern compositing technology, well, let's see what I can do with this JPEG still from the internet. Now, we're not going to get much dynamic range out of this image. Certainly working off the actual print would be much, much more helpful. But first, I'm going to desaturate the colors a bit and darken it down. Nighttime has a way of reducing dark areas into more muted, limited color range. Then I'll take the Mad Max route and give everything a blue tint. I mean, better blue than red or green, right? Next, I'll matte out the sky and the trees in front of them. Then drop in some night sky image and color grade it closer to our mid-ground elements. Then, using the matte I created from the trees against the bright sky, I'm gonna pump a solid dark bluish color into them and layer them back on. Yes, we're losing a lot of bark and leaf detail, but it's nighttime and it's a sacrifice I'm more than willing to make in order to get away from the radioactive tree look. And also, I like how the hunter in the background is silhouetted against the night sky. And then I'll add a little brightness in the trees closer to the screen left moonlight. And finally, if I feel it's a little too blue, I can desaturate the whole image a bit or, whatever. And voila! Look, it's far from perfect. Really pretty stylized and could use a lot more tweaking. This was basically a rush job, folks. However, still about 1 billion times better than the shit Warner Brothers served up. Note to Warner Brothers, if you want this done properly, that is all.